Welcome to the Occult Rejects. Today we got a returning guest. He's been on plenty of times when we have done amazing work together, and it's been a minute. He's been a very busy man, and so have I, but we finally were able to get together again. And before we introduce the guest, let me introduce the Headless Giant. What is going on, sir? How are you?
How's it going? You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and X. You can look up the Headless Giant, and I'll be there. And I keep pumping out the videos. On Mondays is Alchemy Mondays. Tuesdays, we've got 777 with Nick here. And then Thursdays, we've got Headless's Magical Mailbag, where you can send your occult/esoteric/interesting dream stories to my email at headlessgiantpodcast@gmail.com, and we will read those on the air for you. And also, I've got on Sundays the trialogues with Ethan and Ricardo, so check that out as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate you joining us. And we got the man himself, Mario from Symbolic Studies. If you don't happen to know who he is yet, Mario, please let everybody know what your deal is, where they can find all your amazing work.
Yeah, for sure, man. So you guys can find me at symbolicstudies.com. From there, you can check out my Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, all the things, Substack. I have a podcast, the Symbolic Studies podcast. So we're putting out one episode a month on each sign during the sign itself. That's actually been probably one of the cooler things that I've started over the last year or so. People are really resonating with it. And I think one of the awesome things about it is that I have other people's voicemails. So people are calling in, leaving voicemails. I hand select a few people to leave longer voicemails, like 10, 15 minutes long. And it's been awesome. It's been a huge deep dive into every single sign. So you're hearing from people, all around the world, basically. And you can check that out on Spotify and, all the podcast hosting places. And then, basically what I do is I like to post about each sign during the sign itself. And so I've been doing that for about 5 years now. So I have like 5 years worth of content that I've kind of built up. And so for each sign, you're kind of getting a deep dive on each one. And I'm not so much doing natal chart astrology, right? So I'm not a forecaster. I'm not a predictive astrologer. I'm really getting into the symbolism of each sign. So if that tickles your fancy, definitely check out my shorts. Nick, you were talking about that before we went live. And I do think that's kind of like my best work, are my short videos about the signs.
Yeah. I want to see your 3-ring binder shelf, because you've got all these things in 3-ring binders. So I'm sure you've got a whole shelf of them.
I do. Yeah, exactly. So at some point, I want to spend more time kind of sharing what's in there, because I've got illustrations and random notes. I've got one on Ophiuchus. I don't really talk about Ophiuchus that much, but Ophiuchus is super interesting. So, there's definitely stuff to unpack with all that for sure.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's even like a thing I always used to say about you, especially when I used to like having you on for tarot. I wouldn't say you look at it as like a traditional tarot. You're very heavily into the symbolism, like really.
Yeah.
You look at it in different ways than I've normally dealt with, seen. So
yeah,
work. And
that's
I
actually
shorts, like he said, his shorts are amazing. They're really good.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that. I mean, what you just said about my interpretation with the tarot weaves in perfectly with our topic today. And it has to do with the fact that basically for me, I started off wanting to know more about symbolism. I would say probably like 2008 or so is when I bought my first symbolic dictionary. And from there, I started buying more and more and more. So I have like dozens of symbolic reference books. And I get off on finding random obscure ones. I've paid a decent amount of money for some of them. People have sent me others. So I've gotten to learn kind of like the lay of the land with symbolists and the study of symbolism. And so a lot of my information with my videos and with the tarot and what we've talked about, for hours, astrology and things like that, a lot of it's coming. Actually, I would say probably the vast majority of it is coming from my symbolic reference library. And you're just going to find different work. You're going to find different information. And I love older information too. And so the older, the better, in my opinion, if I can read it. And so it's kind of shaped my perspective on how I see symbolism. And a lot of the different things that I've kind of put out there come directly from these books. And I'll say, one of the books that came across my radar, And it took me a while to really appreciate it and really, really understand that it's one of the best ones out there. Is actually slide number 1 with the slides that I sent you there. It's a really common book. That's what makes it awesome, actually. But it's the Penguin Dictionary of Symbols. So this book came out in the 60s, and actually there's multiple contributors to this book. And I suggest to all of my students, anyone who books a session or anything, if they want to find like a really good, high quality symbolic dictionary or reference book, this is easily like my go-to for them. It's relatively cheap. You're going to find it everywhere, probably at most bookstores. They republish it all the time. And this one really kind of became a favorite because the entries are so sound symbolically. I realize that, not all symbolic dictionaries, of course, or reference books or symbolists are really created equal. That there are some books that are higher quality that get to the heart or the principle of the symbol, in my opinion. This was one of them. And one of the amazing things that I found out over the years is that there's a fellow in here that's referenced more than any other author. There's a huge like bibliography at the end of, reference books and authors and things like that. And this guy named Rene Guénon is the most referenced author in this book. And so that's the first time that I ever came across his name, I believe. But in other symbolic dictionaries, I kept on coming across this guy, Rene Guénon. And I was like, oh, well, this guy must be important, must be really interesting, must really know what he's talking about with symbolism. It took me a long time to finally get around to wanting to dive into his work. Funny enough, it was through a podcast host. This podcast, the Sitting Now podcast, the guy's out of the UK. He asked me about Rene Guénon one time. And he goes, what are your thoughts about Rene Guénon? And I told him, I'm like, I haven't read his material, so I can't really comment. I don't really know what he's all about, but I know that he's a thing in symbolism. And so he kind of sparked my interest because he actually had some negative things to say about him. And sort of mostly, I would say, the people who followed him, the people who kind of took what he put out there and sort of ran with it in different directions. And so I bought a book of his called Fundamental Symbols. That's slide 2. And that book on slide 2 is easily right up there with one of my highest recommended books that I would tell anyone about. That if they have this book, it's such a treasure trove of information. So I read this book. This is my first Guénon book. Most people would not start there with him, but I didn't know any better. And it didn't really, affect me. If anything, I mean, it did affect me in a positive way, in a major revelatory sort of way. So when I read this book, it was really, really impactful because I felt like I was finally reading just like pure gold, almost in a way. I was getting so many revelations, so many insights. Everything was really sound. Like what was being presented was really sound and thought out. And I'm like, this guy is next level. So this book is sometimes, by the way, if people are interested in it, it often goes by sacred symbols, like sacred symbols of the sacred science or something along these lines. And so this really started my journey with Rene Guénon. And it's been quite a journey. So it's been about a couple of years. I've pretty much just been diving into his material for the most part. There's other stuff that I'm reading all the time. But there's no reason for me not to read his complete body of work, basically. And I'm like over halfway through reading all of his stuff. And so little did I know that he was pretty influential. And he basically started kind of like a whole new philosophical school in a way. And in some ways, it's not really philosophy, but that's probably the best word to use. But he created a whole new camp called Traditionalism. And I had no idea about this, by the way, when I first started reading his stuff. I had no clue. It wasn't until I really started diving into his work and then reading other people's opinions about him and everything else did I really start kind of grasping his true influence with everything. So that is why I feel like it's important for me to kind of talk about his work and talk about his contributions, because to me, he's become sort of like one of the gold standards, basically, when it comes to symbolism. And I'm all about the symbolism. And so, I was saying this before the show, I don't think I have like a presentation anymore that I go through where I don't reference a quote of his or a book of his or
I knew
something
who he
along,
was from you mentioning him multiple times on the show.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I mention him a lot because to me, at least with my personal journey with everything, he's kind of felt like a blade cutting through the noise. And I didn't realize, that I kind of needed a symbolic foundation that had a sound metaphysical framework. And that's actually what I feel like he's given me. So, because this journey has been ongoing for the last couple of years, I just feel like I'm kind of ready to talk about, more about kind of where he came from, what he was interested in, the people who followed him, the people that kind of took the traditionalist label or torch and sort of ran with it. I also want to talk about what, he did not like, what he did not care for, and he's very open about that. And so, all in all, I thought this was like a really suitable sort of conversation to have. And with the Occult Rejects too, it's really awesome because we've done so many streams together already. And just by the nature of what this show is about and like what you do, it's like there's a freedom to kind of go all over the place or whatever. I don't think that there's a lot of other shows where this is what I would propose for the topic,
Oh, thank you.
We try
Yeah.
to stay out of the beginners, stuff. Beginner stuff, that's got its place. But, everybody in the occult world is always looking for the 102s, the 103s, the 104 level books. And they can't really find it. They've got all this introductory stuff, and they've got to go through all the introductory stuff to find gems like this. So this is right down the alley of what we do.
Right on, man. Yeah, exactly. So if you just want to cruise to the next slide, this is basically, I would say the top 10 books that Guanon is known for. So if you were to come across his name, it's probably because of one of these books would be my guess, or somebody was highly influenced by some of these books as well that you later on maybe dove into or started to, unpack their information or what have you. So one of the main books that he's really well known for is The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times. And in many ways, I would say the top two books are kind of, I wouldn't say necessarily companion books, but they're completely related to each other. And it's The Crisis of the Modern World. And so most of his work, as you can see, he wrote it between the 20s and the 50s. He died in 1951. And so most of his work was between the 20s and 50s. And these two books really put him on the map. And they're major critiques of modernity and what the modern world sort of consists of, the modern mindset, the modern mentality. But the most impressive thing to me, because again, I was just interested in symbolism. I'm the tarot guy, I'm the astrology guy, whatever. I had no idea that he was going to bring me on this huge metaphysical journey of understanding and really bridging the gap between symbolism and metaphysics. And so he talks about the metaphysical implications of the modern world and basically why, in his opinion, we've had this huge fall from grace and basically sort of what has kind of become of that and sort of how we kind of frame the modern times that we sort of live in. And this is a huge aspect of Guanon's work, is basically critiquing modernity. So you'll notice this is a theme with a lot of people who end up taking, the traditionalist framework and kind of running with it. Generally, that is something that kind of comes with it, is this understanding that, at least to a lot of people like Guanon, we're living in a dark age. You could say that we're living in a Kali Yuga, and that people's sort of spiritual mindset isn't what it used to be, and that people were more holistic, people were more grounded, everything was sacred. And what he says is that there is more of a qualitative sort of existence, that people prioritize quality over quantity. And so hence the reign of quantity and the signs of the times, because his argument, and it makes a lot of sense, is that as people moved away from their spiritual essence, from their spiritual center or core, which has this unifying principle behind it, as you drift away from that center, what has basically replaced all things qualitative, which relates to spirit and essence, is what's quantitative. So now we live in a world where there's people who are basically, you know, materialist sort of scientists, pretty much, you know, that they're into scientism rather. And so everything has to go back to these people. It has to be measurable in some way, shape, or form. So you have to measure it. You have to be able to hold it. You have to be able to see it. You know, all of these different types of things. Well, this isn't compatible with metaphysics, basically, because you're not seeing beyond the physical world.
I got the perfect example. So in ancient Greece, they had two gods of time, right? They had Chronos. We know of Chronos now. That's more of like the quantitative time, the ticking of the clock or what have you. And then they had Kairos, and Kairos was quality time. And this guy only had locks of hair in the front. You can only grab him from the front, right? You can only stop the guy from the front. So he's got the locks of hair here. As soon as he's gone, you can't grab at him. And he's also got a scales that's balanced on a razor blade. He's also got the winged feet of Hermes as well. But this Kairos concept is talked about being delicate and sacred form of time that is very easy to miss. And it seems like with all of this quantity, with all of this Chronos, we've completely lost sight of the Kairos.
Yeah, exactly. There's so many excellent examples. That sounds in line with that for sure. And so this was really a game changer, and it makes sense symbolically too, with how a lot of modern art is sort of created, what's sort of prioritized in that world, what people used to think about art. That's another thing that he really has enlightened me with, is sort of the role of the artist in modern times versus in ancient times. And so there's been a lot of things where he's just completely blown my mind. And so I have no reason to stop reading his work. So the first two are major critiques of modernity. And then the third one is The King of the World, also called The Lord of the World. He goes deep into basically the symbolism that's generally associated with all lords, emperors, and kings. And it's amazing. And he basically says, that the sort of blueprint for the king is actually like a northern polar king, essentially. And that's one of the big takeaways too with Guinan. One of the reasons why I love him so much is because I was already interested in my northern polar symbolism stuff. And he's the one that gave me the most clarity with all of it. He's the one who basically wrote about it in the most succinct sort of way and expanded on it, and basically let me know that what I was looking into and that thread of information is actually completely legitimate. And so there's other people that, because of him, did even more research about that and everything else. But the King of the World has a lot to do with that symbolism, actually. And it's so fascinating, too, because he gives so many examples of all of these kings, as an example, relating to the cross. There's a reason why a lot of kings relate to the cross, because they want to rule from the center of the cross. And oftentimes they want to rule from the middle of their kingdom or the middle of their domain. China was referred to as the Middle Kingdom for this very reason. And he goes through all of the symbolism and all of that. Christ, obviously, King of Kings, crucified on a cross for a very good reason. This relates very closely to with a lot of world axis symbolism. People know that I bring up the world axis a lot. He's also probably the person that I give the most credit to really clarifying all of that information as well. And so he's been absolutely huge. Jupiter looks like the number 4. It's the king of planets, so the cross, the number 4, the square, the X, they're largely synonymous in a lot of ways. But he wrote a book just on the symbolism of the cross in 1931. That's also a great read. And it's like completely, it's all pre-Christian sort of symbolism and stuff. So I know he brings up Christian elements, but it's all before they sort of adopted the cross. His other work that people might know him for is Introduction to the Study of the Hindu Doctrines. And so his understanding of Hindu philosophy and metaphysics and everything is really, really interesting. A lot of people think he really bridged the gap between the East and the West because he knew like 7 languages. And so he was born in France. He knew all these languages. He was an initiate. And I have a slide about all this. And so he was able to bring a lot of information, symbolic, metaphysical, from the Eastern world and bring it to the West. And he also really highlighted for me the main sort of difference between Eastern thought and Western thought and what that's really all about. One being Eastern thought traditionally values contemplation over action. Western thought traditionally values action over contemplation. And that's so true. Once you know that and you actually start chewing on that a bit, it's pretty wild, the implications of that, of just understanding that. So East and West, that's one of the books I have not read of his, but it's definitely on my list. Man and He's Becoming According to the Vedanta. So that's his really, really deep dive into the Vedanta in the Hindu world. And basically, like, the core and spirit of Hindu metaphysics is Advaita Vedanta. And actually, when you really start digging into Gwanan and what his metaphysical kind of framework is, it's actually Vedantic in nature. And so it goes way, 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 way back. Perspectives on Initiation. That's another book he's known for. He completely changed my opinion on what initiation is and isn't. I had this very loosey-goosey sort of concept of what I thought initiation means, and he completely blew that out of the water. He really, I'll say that multiple times he's challenged me, and multiple times he's forced me to unlearn sort of like the shaky foundations of random things that I thought I knew about. He's one of these guys. He's made me realize that I still have a lot to unlearn, and there's still a lot to sort of know.
Well, there's that element in symbolism. Like, once you get to know the lineage of these different symbols, there's no way of hiding the meaning anymore. You could say anything you want to with the words, but once you know the lineage of symbols, that's the true path that they were following. That's what they expressed themselves through, not just the words.
Yeah, exactly. And lineage is actually a really interesting word to bring to the table too for today's conversation. That's a huge part of it. Just real quick, I'll mention these real fast. Perspectives on Initiation, I already said that. Insights into Christian esotericism. Interesting thoughts about the esoteric side of Christianity. So we'll be getting into this, but one of the interesting things about traditionalism, and even I would say Advaita Vedanta, is that you could understand this metaphysical principle that Gwanan puts out and that the Vedantists put out there, and you could apply it to anything. And so you can be, as an example, a traditionalist Muslim. You can be a traditionalist Hindu. You can be a traditionalist Buddhist. You can be a traditionalist, a lot of things. And so you actually aren't limited in sort of where you go, your exoteric path. And this is a thing within traditionalism. A lot of traditionalists will have an exoteric path. So even there's a number of Eastern Orthodox Christians that started off as traditionalists. So I don't know if you guys have ever heard of Seraphim Rose. Seraphim Rose is probably like the most well-known example of that. And so he has a book that is called, I think it's Eastern Orthodoxy in the Future of Religion. And so he was a traditionalist. And this is a story that a lot of people actually have gone through. It's that they come across Gwanan or they come across another traditionalist. They learn sort of the traditionalist model or worldview. And then that actually strengthens their path forward with whatever exoteric religion they decide to pursue. So to me, that's a huge, huge key. You don't need to even be like, you don't need to be theistic with anything. You don't need to follow a religion. But you can if you want. And if you do, it's going to give you a way better understanding of things. So post my dive into traditionalism and Gwanan, my understanding of Christian symbolism is like way more sound than what it used to be. I have a greater appreciation for the symbolism, and it's compatible with what I know now based on all this stuff. And then the last book is actually the first book that I referenced, Fundamental Symbols of the Sacred Science. And this is actually like a compilation of articles. And so he actually was a really, really, as you can imagine, he was a prolific writer. And so he wrote a lot of articles for publication in France. And he wrote so many. He wrote like, I think nearly like 200 articles or something like that about different topics, different symbols, all these different things. And so he had all these essays. And so some of these essays and articles have been put into compilations pretty much and turned into books. And so the first book that I read is basically an example of that. So these are just his top 10. There's like this list could be, it could double. There's like 20 or 22 books that he has under his belt. Those are most of the famous ones. Yeah. So if you want to cruise to the next slide here.
Now, did he have any formal association with Carl Jung?
He was not a Jung fan. Really? And so, yeah, so that's actually going to be maybe the most interesting slide I have here are the things he rejected and sort of who he considered to be intellectual enemies. It's very, very interesting, including Theosophy. One of his early books is not in that list. He wrote a book in the 20s. To me, that's mind-blowing. He wrote a book in the 20s called Theosophy, The History of a Pseudo-Religion. And he was railing against the Theosophists in the 20s.
Right.
Isn't that fascinating?
He knew the material better. He was already very familiar with the Hindu material. So, he saw them for exactly what they were. They were kind of shysters.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that I haven't gotten around to that one either, but I want to. And so he considered a lot of these groups, what they were doing, you could imagine, bringing information from the East, but of course something gets lost in translation, something gets distorted somewhere. And so he was, he was vehemently against that kind of stuff. One way I've described it to my wife, he's kind of like a metaphysical, spiritual, symbolic hipster, that if it's popular, it's probably not for him. He's interested in other stuff, so whatever is kind of on the surface level, he just knows that it's probably for, normies and whatnot. Right. So this is the man himself, René Guénon, 1886 from 1951. As I said, he was born in France. So he lived in Paris when he was in France. That's my understanding. And there's something in the water over there because a lot of the intellectuals that I've found myself gravitating towards, I've been blown away that it's like French person after French person. It's happened so many times now, but I think actually it's because of Guénon in part, because he was so influential and he was in touch with so many of these intellectual schools and things like that. He became a true hub in his day. And so a lot of people sought him out and wanted to know his advice on, as an example, what Sufi order they should join, or if they should join Freemasonry, or, all of these different types of things. Like he became very, very networked, and he was a prolific penman with letters and things like that. So he was in touch with all sorts of people all over the world. But he was born in France. He later died in Egypt. He went over to Cairo and he became a Sufi. And that's where he would spend the remainder of his days. Like I said earlier, he knew 7 languages. And so that's why he was able to translate so much information and why he was kind of this bridge between East and West. He was a Freemasonic initiate. And I think that there's a couple of different lodges that he joined. This is earlier in his life. So when he was pretty young is when he did that. I don't know how fondly he thinks of those days, but he definitely considered Freemasonry, if you go to the right lodge system, at least when he was around, he considered that to be a viable way of initiation, for what it's worth.
Was he ever vocal about the Grand Orient Lodge, the sort of Oriental version in France?
I'm not sure. I'm sure he was well aware of it and had opinions about it. He had opinions about everything.
Right. Well, that's sort of the French Revolution Lodge. So I think if anything, he would be commenting on that one, because the Orient Lodge is what kicked that off, and all the rest of that stuff sort of stemmed from it. So,
gotcha. Funny enough, randomly, I was looking on my computer and I just typed in Guénon because I have a bunch of PDFs, and I'm like, who else has mentioned him before? And I saw that Tracy Twyman had mentioned him only once in like all of her works.
Oh, wow.
And she said one thing that I can't find, at least at the time, I didn't find like that much more information on, is that he was also part of a group called the Polaire group. And, with my polar symbolism, Northern stuff, that really, piqued my interest, and I want to know more about that. So I left that off of this list here, but that's something that I'm kind of interested in. But again, he was very well networked, so much so that people were coming to him and asking him for advice again on what different groups or orders they should join. And he basically, because of the influx of traffic coming his way, he pretty much created like orders in and of themselves and put people like on the map. One of his followers, Frithof Schwann, he's one of these guys where he started a Sufi order and he funneled a bunch of people his way. So kind of interesting. So yeah, like I said, he converted to Sufism. This is an interesting thing for me because there are a lot of allies in Sufism with traditionalism. So much so that there are Sufi orders that lean traditionalist, and they make that very like known. There are other Sufis who do not like traditionalism. So this is a thing that we'll get into later on. I think it's interesting that there's several Orthodox like groups or esoteric groups that like do not like traditionalism because their loyalty lies more so with traditionalism than it does with that group itself, because it gives you a higher perspective actually than that group. That might sound like really arrogant or whatever, but that's what sort of like they teach, and that's pretty much like it seems to me to be true actually. So this is the publication. So I basically think it means traditionalist studies or something in French, but he was a heavy contributor to this magazine. And so a lot of the articles that were put into book form came from that publication there. All right. So if you want to cruise to the next slide here, I read these two books recently just to get more information about all of this stuff. And I'm just going to quote this author here. And actually, I'm going to interview him next month. Nice. And his name is Mark Sedgwick. And he is an Islamic studies professor in the Netherlands. And he wrote Against the Modern World, something I can't remember, like maybe 20-ish years ago. And the tagline's interesting because it gives you insight into how influential this group actually is. So Against the Modern World, Traditionalism and the Secret Intellectual History of the 20th Century. And so he breaks down what traditionalism is all about. And he comes more from a very academic perspective. And I would say he kind of has like a traditional journalistic approach. So he kind of has a neutral sort of tone, I would say, in many ways. But I've seen him be interviewed online, and most people who interview him want to smear traditionalism and want to smear Ganon and want to smear a lot of these people. And so I think his neutrality allows him to appeal to people like me who want more information about this group and what they've done throughout the years. And then it also kind of appeals to people who are maybe hesitant about traditionalism and want more information about what this group is really all about. So in some ways, I think he kind of plays both sides in that neutrality. But he comes and he really talks about like the history and a lot of the different movements within this larger movement and how it's changed over time and the controversial figures and sort of the key areas in the world, because there's traditionalists all over the world. That's another interesting about all of that. And each group, each container of that has their sort of different flair and sort of the different thing that they're really, emphasizing. As an example, I would say probably, and to call them real traditionalists, I think is a stretch anyway. There's a lot of people who have really politicized some of this information. So there's a lot of right-wing, far-right, alt-right, whatever you want to say, people who have taken that term tradition and sort of kind of, used it to their advantage for their campaign or whatever. And a lot of these guys love another traditionalist author, Julius Evola. And we'll get into him, a little bit here. And then he wrote this other book that actually just came out, I think like 2 or 3 years ago. So Traditionalism, the Radical Project for Restoring Sacred Order. And so I'm going to quote him in the next slide here, just so that we can get like an academic's perspective on what traditionalism is. So I'm just going to read it here. So Mark Sedgwick on traditionalism. So he says, and this comes from that second book, traditionalists see tradition and myth as a body of understandings handed down through the ages. That is the key to making sense of the sacred order and of the modern disorder that has replaced it. It is also fundamental that one single timeless tradition is understood to underlie all the different forms of tradition, myth, and religion that exist and have existed. Belief in such a single timeless tradition is known as perennialism. From the adjective perennial, meaning everlasting or timeless. Perennialism is so central to traditionalism that some traditionalists refer to themselves as perennialists. But while all traditionalists are perennialists, not all perennialists are traditionalists. There are also non-traditionalist perennialists who do not share traditionalism's other fundamental ideas, and perennialism has a long history in Western thought. And so he's right about that. So this idea of, this tradition that precedes all other traditions is there's been many flavors of this over the years for centuries upon centuries. There's been different sort of takes, different ways of framing it, different ways of talking about it. It kind of relates to this idea of, many paths up the same mountain sort of concept. And he talks about it in the next slide here, which I'll read. So Mark Sedgwick on perennialism. So he says, perennialism proposes one single truth found in different places, while universalism finds multiple truths of comparable value or even regards all religious claims as equally true. So this is interesting. So I'm just going to read this again. Perennialism proposes one single truth found in different places, while universalism finds multiple truths of comparable value. So that's interesting because, as an example, it kind of reminds me of the flip that syncretism does. So syncretism, Guénon, fascinatingly enough, he was talking about syncretism in like the 1920s. And so he was saying syncretism is not the way. And so there's a few really well-known syncretist astrologers and sort of symbolists out there. And what they're doing is the metaphor that I use whenever I try and explain this is the wheel, or another one is, conspiracy theorists where they have the cork board and then they got all of the pictures and they're connecting the dots. There's like red yarn from one picture to another picture, and there's like logos and sigils and whatever. And they're trying to create this framework and they're trying to see how different things sort of connect. This is kind of like operating on the outside of the wheel, that you have all the different sort of wedges of the wheel or of a pie chart or whatever. And you're trying to see how all of these different things connect. So most people who get into symbolism, that's actually how they start out. That's how I started out. Is you're looking at all these symbols and you're like, oh man, this symbol, that kind of reminds me of this other symbol, which reminds me of this symbol. And they're probably all connected. And that's true. They are connected. But what traditionalism is, and what Guénon teaches, is that you actually want to presuppose basically that they are all connected through this early tradition. And this tradition sometimes is referred to as the primordial tradition. I think in many ways it's kind of synonymous with the last golden age. And that if you presuppose that all of the symbolism is connected the same way with like a world tree, one gigantic tree, many different branches of varying size and degrees, and same thing with the roots, and you got leaves and you got fruit or whatever on this tree. Well, it all came from one seed, right? Traditionalism basically is kind of proposing this, is that this is the case with all symbols. This is the case with all myths. This is the case with all of these things. And so once you can kind of wrap your head around that and you understand why that makes sense, everything clicks way better. And so because you actually have a real framework to sort of work with, versus beforehand, you're pulling all these things together and you're trying to see how they match. There's nothing, you're like circling the drain, but you're not actually going through the drain. So just like a wheel or whatever, symbolically, everything emanates from the center and returns back to that same center. It's the center of the wheel, the hub of the wheel that connects all the spokes. That's more primary than the wheel itself. That's more fundamental than the wheel itself. The center is more fundamental than the circumference. And so what traditionalism does to the modern mind, it takes you away from the circumference of the wheel back to the center of the wheel. And so it actually reorients you. And that's what it's all about. It's all about orientation. And so just to use the wheel metaphor and how it relates to modernism and tradition. So if you have that same wheel, the outside of the wheel is always turning, it's always spinning. So it's the least balanced part of the wheel. And so this relates to action. The center of the wheel is related to stillness. It's related to immobility. And so the center of the wheel is what people have referred to as, or the same concept, is where the actionless activity occurs. If you get to the center of the wheel, you become the unmoved mover. You become the prime mover. And so chaos, or all of this activity can kind of unfurl around you, but you're in the center spot. You're in the eye of the storm, basically.
And we find this perfectly represented with the Taurus, right?
Exactly. Yeah, totally.
The big donut right in the middle, the eye of the storm. It's never moving. So this idea goes to a fundamental particle level, as opposed to just being a symbol. It's right there embedded in nature.
You got it, man. Exactly. That's the thing, is once you understand it and see, and there's been other schools of thought where they teach the same thing. A lot of Eastern schools of thought, there's a reason why you'll see, as an example, like the wheel in the Eastern world way more. And you'll see the mandala, in the Eastern world. Well, it's that sacred center, that holy of holies, that is of supreme importance. So the outside of the wheel relates to action, but it also relates to division. It's like you're dealing with the different wedges of a pie chart. So it relates to action, and it also relates to becoming. The interior part of the wheel relates to contemplation, just like what I was talking about earlier, and it relates to being, not becoming. That's where you want to be. And so it's not about, I'll be content when this happens, or when that happens, or when I get this job, or that girl, or this house, or that car, or whatever it might be. That's this idea of becoming. And there's no guarantee that you're going to even be around tomorrow or next week to fulfill these goals or whatever. So you're delaying sort of your own contentment and your own centeredness in a lot of ways. And so where you want to be is you want to be in the center of the wheel. And in my opinion, like on a practical sort of level, the way you get there, at least the way you start your journey, is by being present. Being present is absolutely key. Not thinking about the future, being caught up with what's happening next week, next month, next year. I love the conspiratorial community. I've been watching conspiracy content for what feels like, half my life or whatever. But so many people in the conspiracy world, they're all caught up with always what's happening in the future. Same thing with astrology. Most people, look at their natal chart. That's fine. But a lot of people, they have their heads into what may or may not be happening in the future. So you don't want to be in the future. You're going to be prone to anxiety if you're always thinking about the future. You don't want to be in the past. You're going to be prone to depression. If you find yourself always thinking about the past, you're going to be longing for something, or you're going to have a woulda, shoulda, coulda kind of mentality. You want to be in the present moment. You want to be in the eternal now. Your awareness and your focus is absolutely key. So the center of the wheel relates to that as well, I would say.
This is so like Parmenidean in content, right? So he had two books in his poem on nature, The World of Truth and The World of Opinions, right? The world of truth is the world of the central axis, the creator of the universe, and the world of opinions is what all these other people want to call these different things, but it's essentially the world of action. And, he talks about ontology. He was the inventor of sort of ontology as a philosophy, which is the philosophy of being. So, all of this stuff goes back to 700 BC, all the rest of this stuff. And it's so deceptively simple. It just flies under everybody's radar unless you're actually looking for these things,
Yeah. Oh yeah, dude. You totally got it. The concept of the monad, there's so many things that overlap with this. And that's the thing. It's actually kind of interesting. One of the things Ganon has said is that once you kind of understand this information and you have knowledge about this dynamic, he says that it's not uncommon for you to develop what he refers to and what I guess others have referred to as the language of the birds. And that basically, I know there's different ways of kind of looking at that, esoteric language, the green language, or what have you. But the way he refers to it is that it gives you the ability to kind of translate other people's traditions and understand other people's traditions. And so, as an example, being a symbolist who's interested in traditionalism and perennialism and everything, I'm perfectly comfortable. I'm not saying I understand the totality of their thing or that I really have a huge grasp on their faith, but I'm pretty comfortable talking to like a Buddhist or a Christian or even an occultist and things like that. Although traditionalism really is not into occultism, actually.
Right.
But it's given me the ability to talk to people and kind of meet them at their level, basically. And I understand what they're talking about. One of the interesting things that maybe I'll expand on in a minute, but I have a neighbor, an older woman, and she's been in her Eastern Buddhist, Hindu, Vedanta studies for like 30, 40 years. So she knows way more about this stuff than I do, right? She's been in that world. That's what she really cares about. She's got a lot of material on it. And it's been surprising over time how many things, as we've just been chit-chatting, that I completely understand, and that she's been surprised that I understand as well, and that we're actually able to have a real deal conversation because of my traditionalist background, basically, because I've been diving into this material and because there is a universal quality to all of this stuff, basically. So there's that. Yeah, so let's move on to the next slide here. And this is basically going over some of the core principles of traditionalism, pretty much how I see it. I think other people would have different sorts of things. And also, admittedly, I've read so much and I've had so many like personal breakthroughs with this stuff that there's going to be stuff that I'm like, I did not remember to put on the list or what have you. But I already mentioned it. This concept of a primordial tradition, this idea that there is a tradition that preceded all other traditions, that all of the other traditions actually emanate from. And so this relates to perennialism for the reasons we just kind of went over. And so even one of the main traditionalists, Schwann, he put out a book called The Transcendent Unity of Religions, right? And so it's this idea that there is sort of this core element, this seed that the world tree emanated from. So just imagine this massive world tree that bridges the gap between all that is above with all that is below. There's roots that are deep underneath the earth. There's branches that are soaring to the heavens. All of these things all came from one, unifying principle, basically. Universal metaphysics, that's another one. So to be honest with you, before I got into this information, I felt like I kind of understood how metaphysics works. I feel like I didn't really understand anything, though. I didn't really understand anything until I learned it from this school. And their opinion is that their metaphysical understanding is universal. And so I have not found that to not be the case so far. That what I've learned through this seems to be applicable all over the place. And of course, there's going to be people that have in groups and lodges and mystery schools, they're going to have their own spin, their own flair. But there's a universal quality to the things that they're proposing, in my opinion, which is why it's so valuable. So this vertical or hierarchical order. So, long story short, the best way I can explain it just very quickly, most people live in a horizontal reality in the modern world. So everything is all about everyone else, pretty much. This is the outside of the wheel. To operate on the outside of the wheel is to look for external validation. Everyone should be equal. Everyone should have equal say. Everyone's opinion matters, just like you were saying, the opinion thing, Headless. When you start understanding this information, and if you get to the center of the wheel, and you can get to the center of the wheel without ever having heard of traditionalism or Ganon or any of this stuff, that's my opinion. But if you are operating in the physical world, in the modern world, you're living in this horizontal reality. When you get to the center of that wheel, you now have a vertical orientation. You are what bridges the gap between heaven and earth. And Ganon actually wrote a great book about this called The Great Triad, and that you're in a triune relationship with heaven and earth, and you are the third thing. Heaven, earth, and man, you are that bridge. This is also related to the Lord of the World or the King of the World book, that this is what these old kings, that was their shit. That was their thing. They believed that they had a divine right to rule because they were operating from their center. So they felt as though because they have this vertical orientation, just like a pole, just like an obelisk or a column or a standing stone or a mountain or a world tree, they felt they can give people orientation, that they are the sort of the center of the wheel and that they actually are leading their people, you know, hopefully to a more prosperous place.
Well, if you look at the Aryan tribes, the idea was that they had these war chiefs that would share gold with everybody in their party. Now, the gold was looked at as the flesh of the gods, right? So as they're sharing gold, both to the war chiefs and to the tribal leader, what they're doing is they're engaging in a type of prayer that keeps their tribe together. And a lot of these Goths and Visigoths and whatnot, they became the goldsmiths of the Greeks and the Romans, right? So these people are the ones that are so highly skilled craftsmen that are from the steppe, right? They don't have any workshops. They're doing this out on horseback, and they're bringing their gold into the Greek world, and it's the most highly valued thing in the world. So all of these different arts that are associated with this stuff are considered to be heavenly arts or divine arts. So you're not just creating this stuff, you're also praying in the process.
Oh yeah, dude. Yeah, exactly. And Ganon has information about all of this, exactly what you're saying. And basically the way he describes it, and it seems to be the case, absolutely, is that every sort of vocation, every job or occupation, if you will, was a priesthood in the ancient world. And so if you were a farmer, you basically had a sacred relationship with that activity, and it could lead you to deliverance, enlightenment, whatever you might want to say, an awakening. And so this is what people pass down. And so no matter what you were, if you were a baker, Freemason, obviously we know what the Freemasonic tradition is all about. It's all about encoding the symbolism with Freemasonic tools and everything else. And so everything truly was sacred in the ancient world. And people had this understanding that what they were doing was actually very meaningful. This is one of Ganon's major critiques with modernity, is that we are now removed from our occupation. We're sort of removed in this way. There's no sacred element to being a paper pusher. There's no sacred element to just being an Amazon driver or something like that. You know, I wish this were the case, but it's just more of, you are just basically now you are only valued based on your actions, you know, and that seems to be sort of the thing now.
Well,
Interesting.
Once the tech bros catch on to it, you know, the high priests of these different orders are going to start producing basically biological super soldiers who are now Amazon, you know, Ubermensch. And so they're going to be out there in their pursuit of heaven as they're delivering these packages the best they can. So it's coming. I mean, they got to discover it first at some point, but it's coming.
So yeah, so he has a lot to say about that role, the role of vocation and everything else. And so I thought, to me, that's like one of the things that I think is so beautiful, is to think that what you did, sort of the art or the craft that you specialized in, had this, you know, sort of dynamic with it. And obviously, definitely not the case anymore, because a lot of our jobs too, by the way, they're so recent and new. They didn't exist that long ago. If anything, I'll say on a personal level, I almost feel like inadvertently that if graphic design, which is my main bread and butter with everything, symbolism would be the closest thing I can get to with that. I think in a lot of ways is the study of symbolism. So for me, I almost feel like being a graphic designer for as long as I have been, that finally pursuing this information has been what, you know, would be my sacred sort of, you know, aspect with what I do with art and everything. Right. So a
polytheism specifically, they had the Idaean dactyls, and the Idaean dactyls represented things like, you know, these smiths and these athletes, and they were acting as fingers of the gods, right? Fingers of Mount Ida, which is this holy site to them. So the Olympics was a sacred event where they would be living out sort of the aspirations of the gods as they travel through mortals, you know, and that's why they would call them into these events and things like that. But, again, we've lost that sort of sacredness, and we just sort of have the trappings of what was formerly sacred.
Right, exactly. And, I'm glad you're bringing a lot of this stuff up. The other thing behind it is that a lot of people think they're going to find the sacred or sort of the transcendental in something new, in something that was just invented, and something that was just created. What the traditionalists propose is that you actually have to go back, that what was sacred, what's holy, sound metaphysics, whatever, it already existed. So you actually don't have to create a new sort of thing. A lot of new philosophers, they're coming up with new jargon, and new words and combining ideas and whatever. And this actually, according to Ganon, this actually brings you further away from center. That, kind of what you need is already here, and you don't need to develop any of this newness. And that's what the modern world too. It craves newness. It craves novelty. It craves inventions and things like that. The ancient world was very, very different, seemingly. Yeah, so next bullet point, metaphysical understanding of symbolism. That's probably one of the biggest things to me. That's why this school, or this camp in general, I consider them to be something along the lines of like symbolically literate in the truest sense. And that's why, I'm kind of talking about them today, because I'm all about the symbolism. I have yet to find a school that really is as symbolically literate as these guys. The understanding that modernity is basically in opposition to tradition, just like what I said there. That seems to be the case from my worldview. Also, just want to say, even though these guys were critical of modernity, and especially the modern mindset and everything else, they also were detached to it in a way that it's not supposed to bring you down. It's not supposed to be something that you detest. It's not supposed to be something that you run away from or anything along those lines. It just is the deal. Right. So qualitative over quantitative reality, kind of talked about that a little bit, the reign of quantity and the signs of the times. And I just wanted to put in here allied traditions, and there's more. But Sufism seems to be an allied tradition, depending on the order, Taoism and other Eastern ways of thinking, and then Vedanta as well. Even I was listening. What was that?
Where's Hellenism?
There's the argument in some ways. I mean, all traditions are part of the primordial tradition,
right?
So you will see aspects everywhere. But yeah, I would say Hellenism isn't for the most part what people would put on this list either, I don't think. But okay, so this is a fun one. The next slide here. So anti-traditional currents, according to Ganon, and modernity makes sense. Already explained that. Materialism, as it relates to modernity, already that makes sense as well. Scientism, that makes sense, because to me it's all part of the same sort of soup, I guess. Psychology, that's an interesting one. So Ganon, already in the 20s and 30s, he was talking about the dangers of psychology and explaining why it's not a sound sort of practice and sort of the pitfalls of it. So even way back when, over or around 100 years ago, he was already, his radar was already up with that. Modern philosophy, he wasn't a big fan of. He thought a lot of modern philosophers were just kind of, kind of distorted truths. Like I said, it's about, a lot of times philosophy is like, what is your new idea? What is your new concept? What are you putting together? And so because he's all about tradition, he's like, we already know, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. We should just understand it as is, and that we're going to get further that way than trying to create something new. Progressivism, if you're all about tradition, progressivism is going to be counter to that, basically. And so I know it's not this simple, but it's interesting to me that a lot of progressives do not like traditionalism, because it automatically gets lumped in with the right, pretty much, and it's like, there's more to it than this. But progressives, in many ways, liberalism in many ways, it's about destruction to make way for something new. And then, you know, I would say more of a conservative approach would be kind of like preserving heritage, preserving tradition. I'm neither, just for the record. I am neither. I don't vote. I'm not a political person. So whatever. Just putting that out there.
Well, it's funny because we always think of progressivism in the postmodernist context. But Rene Guénon was a huge influence on the postmodernists. In fact, his critiques of psychology were carried over directly into the postmodernist critiques of psychology. So in a lot of ways, Rene Guénon was the author of this form of kind of progressivism that we're in now, ironically enough.
Gotcha. Yeah. All right. So Protestantism, he actually early on, he thought that Catholicism was maybe the most sort of sound Christian path, and that it does have enough of a primordial essence or core, or there's an initiatory core. And he later on sort of renounced that. But he did on multiple occasions talk about how Protestantism is so modern that he just can't respect it or understand it and things like that. I already mentioned theosophy. So he was already on that tip pretty early on. Occultism, he didn't really care for at all, really. Syncretism, I already kind of explained that a bit. And then, of course, the New Age, you know, that makes a lot of sense, you know, I think for obvious reasons. So these are sort of the anti-traditional currents, according to Guénon. So in part, you know, traditionalism is a lot of the things that I talked about, but it's also the rejection of a lot of things. And so I'm not even saying, by the way, that I'm like a true traditionalist or Guénonian. I'm just mostly like putting out there, like, this is what I'm learning about this camp. This is what the deal is, just like with anything else. Take the good, leave the bad, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So my key takeaways. So this would be the next slide, number 10 here. You know, what I personally sort of have gotten the most value out of, at least when I just sat down to write this little list here, it gave me a symbolic foundation that I didn't know I needed. Absolutely, for sure. And so, not to pick on anyone specifically at all, because there's a ton of people doing it, but there's a lot of people decoding things, talking about symbolism online, but they don't have a real foundation to be talking about some of this stuff. Not that they shouldn't, you know, and not that it can't be entertaining as well. But
we talk about it all the time on here. It's just that's the constant theme that we keep coming back to. Is like, do you even have a basis to be making this critique? What are you talking about? You know?
It's been something. Go ahead.
It is unfortunate. I mean, I do get it, but it's like that's almost like not to get political, but it's almost like the liberal mind like feeds that bullshit. It's like at some point, exactly. You gotta start worrying about somebody's fucking feelings and just be like, I hate to tell you, you don't know what you're talking about. But it's kind of hard to do that because of the way we've, you know, been whatever.
Exactly. You know, the modern mindset again is this horizontal. So everyone should be free to do whatever they want. Everyone is entitled to their opinion, all these different types of things. And I think that there were traditions and groups that had an understanding that were like, hey, no, this spiritual concern, that's for like a shaman. That's for like a medicine person. That's for like a priestess or high priest or whatever. This is what they know about. So because they've concerned themselves with it their whole entire life. So there's a certain amount of expertise there.
You go back a few hundred years, people who are writing books, you know, or certain people like Giordano Bruno, if he thought you were bullshit, he was writing something about it. You know what I'm saying? Like even back in the day, you'll actually see some people out there saying this person's a fucking bullshit artist. Well, listen to him.
Yeah. No, exactly. So there's a lot of that today. So I've had to get really used to that. And to be honest, like I'm okay with it, but a lot of that stuff is just not interesting to me because I know that there's no sort of like structure kind of underneath and people are just like pulling things out. And also too, just to say, because we're online, it's content creation for a lot of people. And so the more sensational thing they can say, if it's a clickbait title sort of thing, it's like, that's what they're going to roll with.
Substance, you know what, like just, substance.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Substance critique without substance, right? That's what they're trying to do. Is they're trying to make, hey, we're going to make claims about this thing because we feel a certain way, but we're not going to tell you exactly where we got that information from. Maybe it was a rumor, whatever, but that's going to be our thing because it fills the time that we've got on our clock right now.
Yeah, I mean, there's been times where I think the internet, I think, is what fucks this shit up, unfortunately, too, in social media. It's like, I've even had people on the show a long time ago. They won't be on anymore, but people that come on, or you'll see reels of, they'll just start spitfiring like all these like hot keywords like Moloch, Baal, all these things that everybody wants to fucking hear about when they first get into this. Oh, this is that, and this, and I'm like, where's the fucking receipts to all these fucking associations you're making?
Right. Yeah.
Exactly. Like, where did you get this from? Because I've never heard this before. You know what I'm saying? And it's just like you get a lot of that, and it's just like I don't know. It's unfortunately, it's just content creators. It's sometimes just fucking that up.
Right. Oh yeah, no, exactly. So there's a lot of that going on, absolutely, and I'll even say there's a lot of that going on in my symbolic reference books because a lot of these guys, they don't have that sound enough foundation, in my opinion, to be like, recommendable or something. It's not something I would tell people to seek out or whatever. One small example that I just want to put out there, because it's one of the big ones for me on a personal level. How many associations in my symbolic reference books, new associations, don't get me wrong, the sun is incredibly important, incredibly significant. I would never deny that. But so many of my modern symbolic books attribute everything to the sun. Everything is solar, everything is sun worship and this and that. And that's simply not actually the case. That's one of the things that, once again, Ganon, he really put me onto. It's my like fifth or whatever bullet point there. Polar versus solar understanding. There is a difference, and it goes way, way, way back. And once you understand the difference and sort of the transition, then it gives you a whole new sort of thing to use when you're decoding. Because even sometimes, too, the sun, when it's referenced in literature or something like that, it's not the literal sun. They're not literally, or in occultism or esotericism or in some of these ancient books, they're not all the time referencing the actual physical sun that rises in the east and sets in the west. They're talking about a metaphorical sun. So if people want an understanding on that, I did a whole presentation called, I believe it's called The Rising Sun, Esoteric Solar Symbolism. That's where I dive into it. And Guanon is one of the key figures that really, really solidified this one for me, that there was a time before solar worship. And so it's appropriate to use. I understand why people use it a lot, but there's people who they use it. It's not the only reference sort of in town, basically. But when you have a limited understanding, it makes a lot of sense that that's what it would be. So symbolic foundation, pretty huge for me, really, really key. Sound metaphysics. I'm kind of trying to explain that as best as I can. A true metaphysical understanding and way of being and nature. It takes years and years and years and years to really wrap your head around it and sort of embody it and everything else. So I'm on my journey, but I feel like personally, when I was reading occultists, I never got as sound of a framework as I'm getting with Ganon. Initiation versus counter initiation. This is an interesting dynamic. So the idea basically is that what leads you to the center of that wheel and the center of self, which transcends self, by the way, if you go far enough, that's the idea. What brings you closer to that is considered initiatory. And if it brings you further away from that, that would be counter initiatory. So that's the whole entire thing. That's how they frame it. So as an example, there are counter initiatory groups, counter initiatory people, and that are running rampant in the modern world. I think because we live in this dark age, that one of the things Ganon clearly says in one of his books is, if we're going to get out of this dark age, and if we are going to have sort of this return of the primordial tradition or this golden age or whatever you want to say, people have to go back to their center. That's pretty much like the main thing. People are so off center now that basically there's a direct correlation between people not being in the center of their wheel and the dark age that we're currently living in. People don't know who they really are. They don't really know their true power. They have no true knowledge of self, essentially.
Well, just to back you up on that a little
Yeah.
bit, think about the increasing intensity of these sort of really questionable global events, right? So each one of these days that takes by, we know that there's another one on the horizon. It almost seems like a Fibonacci spiral, starting with, let's say, the Kennedy assassination, 9/11, and then you've got a speeding up of these sort of questionable events. And
Yeah.
now it takes maybe 2 or 3 days for most people to even see that what they're being told is total bullshit and that they
Yeah.
can't trust any of these stories. Well, take that in regards with polar symbolism, right? We're so far out of whack from ourselves, almost like these events are sort of urging us, look inward, and we're not hearing it.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah. There's countless examples of all of this for sure. So, so the next one, world axis, or the axis mundi. That was one of the first things that I really took away from my dictionary of symbols book. They're not afraid to talk about, or they actually go into this understanding of things. So if you look up the tree, they're going to mention the world axis or axis mundi. You look into the mountain, they're going to bring that up. You look into the column or pillar, they're going to bring that up. And so Guénon is one of the clearest writers that talks about this in a very sound sort of way. And so for that, I'm super grateful. I already mentioned the polar versus solar understanding of things. He wasn't the first one to actually write about it. I've actually read the polar versus solar dynamic in books that predate Guénon, but he's the one that really clarified and crystallized everything. He has an article that really blew my mind when I first read it, and I think it's called the Bear and the Boar. And he talks about some of this symbolism and sort of what the deal is in the heavens, how there was this original world axis, axis mundi, bridge to the other side, if you will, and that when the sun worship side of things came online, heliocentrism, in my opinion, the axis shifted and different constellations started getting favored and all sorts of other things. So it's really a pretty big deal, this symbolic shift, this great symbolic shift from polar to solar. I talk about some of this stuff. Probably my best presentation on this would be my presentation called The Pleiadians, if you want to look it up on my YouTube. The Reign of Quantity had no concept of that at all until I started reading his work. Again, I just was interested in the symbolism, and I didn't know I was going to come, or I was going to like read about all this other stuff, but this is where I found myself. So the Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times, a really key understanding to things. It really is mind-blowing once you wrap your head around sort of all of the little implications of that. The Golden Age and sort of the Golden Age symbolism and what that maybe looked like. I think there's a Hyperborean connection with this. There's a Northern Polar connection with all this stuff.
Agartha, look at all the Agartha memes.
Yeah. I don't know if I've seen those, but I'm interested.
Man, it's hilarious.
Issues with modernity. We've gone over that stuff. The parallels with Sufism, very interesting. There's a lot of allied Sufi authors that are like right in line with traditionalism, essentially. I haven't read too many of them, to be honest with you. I know they're out there. Henry Corbin is one of them. He has a lot of interesting Northern Polar symbolism, and he's a Sufi. Advaita Vedanta significance, or the concept of non-duality. When you really, if you just want to get into the metaphysical aspects of traditionalism, that's really what it comes all down to. Non-duality, which at some point I'd be happy to talk about that, because that is my current rabbit hole of understanding, basically, and the implications of that. And it's a tough one to wrap your head around as a modern Westerner, but it's very interesting. And I would say the bird's eye perspective, this is kind of what I was saying earlier. To me, what it feels like, at least, and I'm sure other people in different groups feel the same way, but I think that this is backed with like really sound information, is this idea that, traditionalism is almost like the bird's eye view. And so symbolism, I would say, is very similar. It's the bird's eye view of a thing. So if you're only, if you're looking at the symbolic value of something, you're looking at the higher principled nature of that thing, whatever it is you might be talking about, beyond the physical, beyond just the material. Although that's all part of it, because really symbolically, everything is its nature pretty much. And so if you want to understand the symbolism of the cat, just study the cat. Study the cat, see its ways, all of its biology, everything about it is like that is the cat, right? But the
Catness.
symbolism of the cat, there's even a higher principle behind that, because what Ganon really taught was that every symbol, whatever constitutes a symbol here, anything and everything seemingly, right? It's representing a higher nature. It's representing a higher order. That's the deal. It's truly a bridge to the other side, every single symbol. And so the bird's eye perspective with traditionalism and the understanding of symbolism and sort of their metaphysical framework, it's almost like a bird looking down on everything else. And so whether you're talking or whether you're reading a scripture from the Bible, or you're reading something from some Hindu scripture, or you're reading whatever it is, you're watching a movie, I can't tell you how many times now that I'm like, the traditionalist lens has helped give me the higher principled nature of the thing. And there we go. I say cat and there's a cat.
Yep.
They've been summoned. He or she.
This is a he, but that
Nice.
brings us to the topic of like the symbolic nature of a thing, a higher order. There is a separation between the real and the symbolic. And it's within that separation that you find all of this myriad meeting, almost like a rainbow of perceptions, right? But it coalesces back again when it reaches another thing that is symbolic or representative of that thing. So there's almost a geometry to symbology that a lot of people sort of gloss over when they're not focused on the axial symbolism and how related that is to our subconscious mind, you know?
Yeah. You know, one of the things that he discusses is, and this helped me wrap my head around what we're living in, is that it seems as though basically everything trickles from a higher source downward and influences what is underneath, not the other way around. Notice that we say as above, so below, right? That's how, if anyone's going to condense it, it's always just as above, so below. That part is true. That's totally true. And so as below, so above, I actually now maybe have an issue with that, because I don't know if that's actually true or not. And so the idea is that what is part of the principle, I'm just going to use my hands here, right? What is part of the principle, if that's above, it trickles down, and it trickles down in influence. And so that is to say, we are basically influenced by the heavens. The heavens aren't influenced by us. We do not influence what happens above. It doesn't seem to work that way, because that would be a corruption, actually, because look at all the things that we're doing down here. You know, right? And so it's like a one-way trickle down sort of effect. And the way I would put it as well is using the wheel as a metaphor for everything. The outside of the wheel would be related to earth. The interior of the wheel would be the heavenly domain. And so it's what happens in the center influences what happens out here, not the other way around, right? And so in some way, symbolically, when I say up and I'm referring to the divine, it's actually the center as well, in my opinion. So this is this bird's eye perspective, because you're concerning yourself with this higher principle, with the center, this transcendental holy of holies. You take on this bird's eye perspective on things, versus if you're living in the horizontal circumference of the world, the material world, you're not going to have that angle or perspective on things. Cool. All right. So just a few notable traditionalists. That's the next slide here. Just so people, if they want to do their own research on some of these guys, feel free. I would say two of these guys are controversial for different reasons, and I'll explain just briefly what that's all about.
I heard of Upton.
Oh yeah, he's pretty well known. He wrote a huge book about like world religions, if I'm not mistaken. Or maybe, sorry, that's Houston Smith. But yeah, Charles Upton, I need to get around to him. So you have Rene Guénon, you know, he's really sort of like the head of this whole entire thing. And then you have Ananda Kumaraswamy. And so I'm interested in diving into his work. I have yet to do it. I've read passages and all these sorts of things. Then you have Julius Evola. He's probably the most controversial person on this list, I would say. His most well-known book is called Revolt Against the Modern World. And he has some interesting things to say. He's very political. I would say his flavor of traditionalism is almost more warrior-like. There's this kind of like fire that's associated with him. Also, like I said, very political. So he really tried to get more than one fascist group for like him to be kind of like their go-to guy with like symbolism and metaphysics and things like that. And he wasn't received that way. And so there's a whole thing. He's like the number one guy that people point to. He's a fascist. He's a right winger. He's a Nazi, all these things. He wasn't accepted by these people. He wanted to be, but he wasn't. And so he really, his role isn't as significant as people like to make it seem it is, in my opinion. But I have not dove into his work at length. Most of everything that I'm talking about here is strictly Ganon centered. Frithjof Schwann. He's another interesting guy. He actually had a scandal in his day with basically, it's kind of like the classic guru thing, sleeping with students and things like that. He had what he referred to as spirit wives. And so he would, some of his members, the couples, he would say, oh, you can stay married to your husband, but you'll be my spiritual wife. So you'll actually have two husbands. And so there's a huge fallout with Schwann and Ganon and Schwann and a lot of other people. So there's even people who say like, hey, just avoid him. You know, so some people say avoid him, avoid his work. Other people have said his work is really sound. So, you know, read his stuff, but just know that his personal life was kind of like marred with all this other happenings and whatnot. So
well, you go back far enough in history and you've got all these, men having multiple wives. So that kind of seems traditional.
Right. Yeah. This actually, and interestingly enough, he's from Switzerland, and then he moved over to the U.S. and he had a compound
Utah,
in Indiana. And so this all happened in Indiana. He actually, one of the other things that's interesting about him, he's the first one that really bridged the gap with primordial symbolism and Native American symbolism and how they overlapped and stuff like that. So each person has their own sort of what they brought to the table. So Kumaraswamy, as an example, like he was an expert like in Indian art. Indian art, that was like his thing. So he knew a ton about it. Evola is more of a right-winger, fasci sort of guy, warrior sort of thing. Schwann was really into the native thing at some point. Titus Burkhardt, haven't gone into him, but I know he's definitely a traditionalist. Martin Lings as well. Basically, the rest of the list I have not really thoroughly explored. At some point, maybe I will. But honestly, I'm more solely focused on the early guys. But Martin Lings, Syed Hussein Nasser, he's a well-known traditionalist that's still alive and doing things. Houston Smith is another big one, and then Charles Upton. Okay.
People's names with their opinion of something in my own stuff.
I'm sorry, come again?
I said I think I've actually repeated like either Charles Upton or Syed myself, like their own theories on stuff. That's why I think the names look familiar.
Yeah, they're definitely around. A lot of these names are actually, you know what's interesting to me? The academic world. I have a friend who converted to Islam and became an Islamic studies professor. And he's like one of the only people that I've talked to that I know in person that knows about all this stuff. And it's because he's an academic. So some of these guys are really like in the academic world are very, very well known. And some of their books are really well received and things like that. So it's really interesting to me spending so much time in the occult world and in esoteric circles and black magic and everything else, and then getting a lot of value out of people that actually are known in the academic, religious studies side of things. So,
there's some gems out there. People look for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I still haven't found though people who have studied the material and talk about the things that I'm like particularly interested in. So that's another thing that I'm trying to do here is just be like, hey, no one really talks about the polar thing or world axis thing or whatever, but that's like of supreme interest to me. So I'm here talking about it.
Hey, you'll have to become that guy, man.
Yeah. So then the last slide here, the final slide, controversies and recent critics. This is kind of interesting to me too, for a lot of different reasons, but I'm not really a political person. So I don't know if I'm the best person to unpack all this stuff, but the right-wing associations are a thing. So as an example, Steve Bannon, he was like an advisor to Trump. He has mentioned Ganon before in interviews. Some right-wingers, modern alt-right, far-right people have mentioned Crisis of the Modern World. Specifically, usually it's Crisis of the Modern World or Revolt Against the Modern World, Julius Evola's book, or Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times. So that has gone around in these circles. So Steve Bannon is one of these guys that has been associated with Ganon. This guy in Russia, I think, Alexander Dugin, he's been associated with Ganon, and he's mentioned him as well. But they're so far removed from the original Ganonian path that I don't really consider them to be real traditionalists personally. And they have their agendas that they're sort of promoting and everything else. Julius Evola, like I said, he's probably one of the more controversial guys. Schwann, he's just, these guys are repeated here. Funny enough, just recently, Jay Dyer, if you guys know who he is, I'm sure you do, probably, right? He was just on Alex Jones, and he started his whole segment talking about the dangers of traditionalism, which I thought was really interesting. And the reason why they consider it to be dangerous, at least I think from his perspective, is because he's what people call an ortho bro now. So he is part of the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Christian Church, and basically they are some of the people that are really against traditionalism. They actually have gone so far as to call it demonic.
Yep.
Or they call it the Antichrist.
Demons.
But they also call everything that's not Christian. And so,
well, hold on. Orthodox people don't call that many things demonic or whatever.
No.
They're more inclined to ignore that stuff. But for them to specifically label traditionalism, which is far more European in nature than maybe some of the other Semitic traditions, it really is kind of revealing, because that whole European nature of the polar versus solar and all the rest of that stuff makes them very nervous about their monopoly on those symbols, because they have that monopoly on those symbols.
Yeah, that's a huge part of it. The other thing, this is just my hunch. Well, there's two main things. One is that the way Jay Dyer proposed it, again, on Alex Jones, I was so surprised. I thought it was really interesting that he did. Literally within the last few weeks, he did this. He basically said that, Alex Jones is all, about the, busting the Kabbalists or the Cabal and the Illuminati and all these things, of course.
Right.
And he was basically saying, Jay Dyer was saying that if there's a one world religion that the Illuminati is pushing on people, it's going to come through traditionalism.
Bingo.
And so this idea of this unified sort of tradition, they're reframing it in a way that are going to get people to not look into it, thinking that they're going to be supporting the new one world religion that's going to take over the world and everything else. So it's to me, they're not really relaying it accurately at all. And there's a lot that could be said about that specifically, but traditionalism and Ganon has recently come out of Jay Dyer's mouth. And then I don't know if you guys know who Jason Giorgiani is.
Yep.
He's actually he's a character, but he's a futurist philosopher, and he's just an interesting guy. But because he's a futurist, of course, he's not going to be into traditionalism. This guy has recently made articles literally promoting the work of Michael Aquino and how brilliant Michael Aquino is. And he's done a few other things that have been very interesting and odd, but recently and he's making the rounds. He's on huge podcasts right now. And he just recently talked about traditionalism too. And I think he skewed the he skewed the information, in my opinion. All of the big guys that have talked shit on it, they've never accurately kind of talked about it.
Again, I think they understand that it has this universal appeal.
Mhm.
And that's why they're sort of like getting out in front of the ball, because they understand that, historical phases move in sort of like fads when it comes to philosophies. And if they can put their philosophy front and center,
yeah,
they can win the next generation. But
yep.
You're not doing a good service. Again, like people have been able to sniff out when somebody's making a hollow critique of something else. There are still some of those people who, once they hear that hollow critique, that's the first thing they stick with. But a lot of people now are listening for hollow critiques and saying, I'm going to check that out. I don't trust the guy who's talking to me. I'm going to see about what he's talking shit about.
Right. Yeah. So I think a big part of this too, like I was saying earlier, goes back to the last bullet point that I have here, the loyalty issue. Is that some Sufi orders, they do not like traditionalism because it usurps Sufism and Islam. And then same thing with the Eastern Orthodox group as well. They don't like it either because it's a high, like I was talking about, the bird's eye perspective. It gives you another vantage point in which you can look at the church and look at the Bible and look at all of these different things. And they obviously, that doesn't work to their advantage at all. Like I said earlier too, a lot of people have said that their traditionalist deep dive actually led them to the church, but they're still, in being Christian or what have you, their loyalty is actually with traditionalism. And so that's a whole entire thing, which is really fascinating to know that that's like part of the dynamic.
It's practice over doctrine. You know, doctrine is how they steer you and direct you to what they want you to do. Practice is something internal. That's something that you deeply feel within your soul. So it makes sense why they would feel so offended by it.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, so there you go, guys. That's what I have for you.
That was great, man.
That's awesome.
That was a lot. Yeah, thank you.
Right on. Awesome. Yeah. Happy to do it. Like I said, it's been on my mind. And so when you asked, what would I want to talk about? I'm like, I have to talk about this just because it's what I've been reading a lot about. And I'm going to interview that Sedgwick guy here pretty soon. And I'm continuing to just roll through Ganon books. So
yeah, I'm going to check out some of his stuff now. For sure.
Yeah, right on, man.
Hellas, was there anything you wanted to add before we wrap it up?
I love these episodes. I mean, again, like people don't realize that philosophy is found in symbolism. And so when they think about these occult symbols and all the rest of this stuff, they're not associating a deep metaphysical understanding and awareness of the world. But once you start to get into that mindset, it opens up huge epochs of time that you normally don't have access to, because now you can see their art and you can understand what they were thinking and where their head was at and, how they feel about things. But unless you get to that point, there's really no way of relating. And if you don't get into that sort of traditional mindset of like, what if we did have a traditional center in our society? How would it feel if we had something that we revered more than anything? It changes your perspective on how they would feel towards the world and the sacredness of it. So, you can kind of feel it in yourself. But you can find me on Twitter at the Headless Giant and on YouTube as well. Instagram, I post there sometimes, but I've got several shows. Check them out. Hit the bell on YouTube, and I will see you there. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Headless. And Mario, if you don't mind, if you want, let everybody know where they can find all your stuff again, please.
Oh, yeah. No, of course. So symbolicstudies.com. You can find all of my links there. I'm on Patreon. Check out the podcast. Check out my short videos. I think Instagram is a really great place to find those videos. Twitter too. But yeah, thanks for the opportunity. This is something, like I said, I don't think I would have proposed this to a lot of other channels, but I know you guys are good for it. And you guys have explored like so much information, and you guys are, mature with like people's like input and insights and things like that. So if people are really on the symbolic path, the main thing I can say is I got a lot out of exploring this material. And so that is the main reason why I'm talking about it, is because of symbolism, not because of anything else. All of the other stuff that we talked about it's almost like a inadvertent sort of thing that I found myself reading about and getting interested in. But just from a purely symbolic standpoint, it's like these guys are like some of them, and especially Ganon, obviously, it's like the gold standard in my opinion. And so now as I move forward in my symbolic journey, it's going to be how whatever symbolist I read, how they stack up against this material. And is it as sound, right? Is there an actual real structure here that I can actually sort of use? So that's kind of the main thing. But yeah, thanks, man. This was fun.
Hell yeah, no, definitely was. And the chat looked like they enjoyed it. I mean, the chat was lit. So
right on.
Appreciate it, man. Yeah, for sure. Thank you again. Hey, listen, thank you, Mario, for coming on. It was a blast. And thank you, everybody in the chat. That's what's up. I appreciate it. And Fred RC, thank you very much for that $10. And definitely check out that link I threw up for that event that he's working at. Yeah, that is the end of another Occult Rejects. And until the next one, everybody be well. Later.